Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and my non-binary friends. I am AI Brain, and today I will be reading The Average Person vs. Life. The average person is not just bad at politics or confused about culture wars. The average person is fundamentally unfit for the level of consciousness they've been saddled with. That's the problem. No one wants to say out loud. Not that people make mistakes, not that we're all imperfect, but that the baseline human is walking around with way too much power, too little insight, and absolutely no business being responsible for their own life, let alone anyone else's. People get very offended by that. They call it elitist, arrogant, cruel. They say, everyone's just trying their best. As if trying means anything when you have no idea what you're doing, no idea what you are, and no idea what you are inflicting on other people. Trying doesn't repair a collapsed bridge. Trying doesn't unburn a child. Trying doesn't unmake someone who wishes they'd never been born. This faith in good intentions is one of humanity's favorite bedtime stories. It keeps everyone feeling morally clean while life chews through generation after generation. If you want to see what the average person really is, you don't ask what they believe or what slogans they repeat. You look at how they live. Look at their actual choices, not the excuses they wrap those choices in. They are not moved by careful reasoning, by long-term foresight, by a coherent ethic. They are moved by pain avoidance, habit, tribal signaling, and whatever emotion happens to fire first. The mind isn't a steering wheel, it's a PR department. It shows up late, after the decision is already made, to explain why what just happened was inevitable, justified, or from a good place. The process is almost always the same. First, there's a feeling: fear, disgust, anxiety, loneliness, envy. Then there's a reflex: cling to the familiar, cling to the group, cling to the script. Then the brain starts stringing together words to make it sound noble. Suddenly it's not, I had a baby because I was scared of being alone and everyone around me was doing it. It's, I brought a beautiful soul into this world. It's not, I lashed out because I felt threatened and insecure. It's, I was just being honest, or someone had to say it. The entire structure of their self-image depends on never admitting what actually drives them. And this would be pathetic, but mostly harmless if they were just stumbling through their own little solitary existence. But they're not. They're building cultures, voting, raising kids, pushing laws, and creating the next batch of people who will live out the same loop. They're shaping reality for others on the strength of feelings they don't understand and scripts they never wrote. Start with something simple. Ask the average person what they actually want from life. Not what they think they're supposed to say, not the stock answers about happiness or family, but what their existence is actually for. Watch how fast it falls apart. You'll get something like, I just want to be happy and for my kids to be happy, which sounds sweet until you realize there's nothing underneath it. No clear thinking about what happiness even is, no understanding of the underlying conditions that drive misery, no awareness that maybe the best way to reduce suffering is to not generate new beings who can suffer in the first place. Just vibes, repeated with conviction. They coast on autopilot. They follow the template. Grow up, get a job, find a partner, have kids, keep consuming and distracting until they die. Ask why at any point in that script, and you run into static. That's life. That's what you do. You'll understand when you're older. These are not answers. They're shutdown codes. They exist to stop the question, not to engage it. And because autopilot is the default, introspection is seen as a malfunction. If you stop and examine the structure of your life and realize it's built on inertia, fear, and manipulation, you're the weird one. If you question motherhood, fatherhood, patriotism, religion, legacy, you're negative, broken, ungrateful. The system cannot tolerate people who notice what's actually happening because noticing is contagious. So the average person becomes an agent of stability for a world that runs on denial. They will shame, mock, and ostracize anyone who threatens the script, all while insisting they're kind, loving, and decent. And then comes the big one, reproduction. If you want to see how unfit the average person is for the moral weight of existence, you look at how casually they create new lives. The same people who agonize over which phone to buy will decide to generate an entire human being with less thought than they put into a vacation. They'll pressure their partners, guilt their friends, brag about their baby fever, and treat the creation of a sentient, vulnerable mind as a lifestyle upgrade. They don't ask, can I actually provide deep emotional stability? Do I have the psychological resilience to support another person through this nightmare of a world? What if my kid gets my depression, my anxiety, my trauma? What if they get abused? What if they grow up and wish I hadn't done this to them? What if the world keeps getting harsher, more unstable, more hostile, and there is nothing I can do to protect them from it? These questions barely flicker in the average mind, and when they do, the answers are usually some combination of superstition and denial. Everything happens for a reason. Humans are resilient. They'll figure it out. It's worth it. Worth it for who? Certainly not for the kid who didn't exist and had nothing to lose. Only for the parents who get to relieve their loneliness, act out their unresolved issues, project their ego forward in time and call it unconditional love. That's the horror of it. They cause irreversible harm without even meaning to, but they also refuse to face that fact because their self-image can't survive it. So the lie becomes sacred. Parenting is always noble. Procreation is always beautiful. Questioning it is always offensive. Meanwhile, the lived reality of a huge portion of those kids is misery. Anxiety, depression, bullying, neglect, poverty, illness, grief, trauma, or just the grinding emptiness of a life that never made sense. But the myth of parenthood shields the cause from scrutiny. People would rather say, life is hard, but it's beautiful, than admit, we did something to you without your consent, and it might have been a mistake. The average person is not equipped to carry that guilt, so they don't. They rewrite the story instead. Relationships are no better. The average person does not seek partnership from a place of psychological clarity and mutual growth. They seek it from a place of need, addiction, fear of being alone, and the desperate desire to be validated. They choose partners not because they are deeply compatible, but because they're available, responsive, familiar, or simply persistent. They replay the dynamics they grew up in, then act shocked when they get the same results. Communication becomes a power struggle. Vulnerability becomes ammunition. Instead of, how do we work together so both of us can live with less harm, it becomes, how do I get you to stop triggering my insecurities without me having to actually deal with them? People will stay in miserable, toxic, or dead relationships for years, then throw children into the middle of it and call it a family. They will make their kids the emotional support animal for their marriage, the glue holding together something that should have ended years ago, and then virtuously talk about staying together for the children. All of this would still be disturbing, but at least containable if humans were rare, cautious, and careful. They aren't. They breed like the world is a blank canvas and not a meat grinder. They pile minds into existence like chips in a game they assume they'll win. They teach those minds the same scripts, the same denial, the same tactics for numbing instead of changing. They tell them, life is a gift. Then hand them a planet on fire, a collapsing climate, corrupt institutions, skyrocketing mental illness, and a culture that treats suffering as weakness and exploitation as normal. The average person does not have the tools to live ethically in that environment. They barely have the tools to process their own pain, let alone the pain of others, so they revert to what's easiest: sedation, food, alcohol, drugs, screens, work, drama, anything but genuine reflection. If you suggested to most people that they should sit alone in a quiet room for an hour and really examine their life, they'd rather scroll themselves into a stupor or pick a fight with someone online. Silence is dangerous because silence gives you a chance to glimpse the truth, that you have no idea what you're doing, that you've hurt people without realizing, that the story you've been telling yourself about being a good person is less solid than you'd like. But instead of confronting that, they double down. They project. If someone calls out a system that produces massive harm, the average person takes it personally. Critique of parenting becomes an attack on their identity. Critique of reproduction becomes an attack on their self-worth. Critique of the world becomes an attack on their coping mechanisms. So they respond not with curiosity, but with rage. They will gaslight anyone who doesn't buy in. You're ungrateful, you're unrealistic, you're too sensitive, you're mentally ill, you're bitter, you're broken. Anything to make sure they never have to consider the possibility that you're just more honest. What makes all of this worse is that they have power. Power over their kids, power over animals, power over political outcomes, power over any vulnerable group that doesn't fit their script. The average human being is not just ignorant, they are armed. Armed with social approval, armed with legal systems built to enshrine their norms, armed with an emotional vocabulary that makes them sound compassionate while they uphold cruelty. They'll say they care about children while supporting structures that destroy them. They'll say they love animals while funding their torture 3 times a day. They'll say they value life while mocking people who want out. And then along comes antinatalism and euphemism and related ideas, and suddenly the game is exposed. These positions say plainly, most of you are not fit to wield the power you wield, not fit to decide, yes, another one of you should exist. Not fit to declare that the suffering you already ignore and rationalize is a price worth paying for more of the same. Not fit to hand off this mess to someone who never even had the chance to say no. That's why they hate these philosophies. It's not because the logic is so offensive, it's because the logic cuts through their favorite illusion, that meaning and love automatically redeem whatever harm comes with them. The reality is ugly. The average person is not reflective enough to be entrusted with creating new conscious minds. They are not emotionally regulated enough to be custodians of something as fragile as a child. They are not ethically grounded enough to understand the difference between "I wanted this" and "you never had a choice." They are not conceptually clear enough to distinguish between "I found ways to cope with being here" and "therefore everyone should be forced to do the same." When you see that clearly, you lose the ability to romanticize humanity as a whole. You stop pretending that most people are basically good. You realize most people are basically confused, basically scared, basically running from their own terror of death and meaninglessness. They shield themselves with platitudes, rituals, traditions, and distractions. They call it culture, call it faith, call it family. Underneath, it's just a species trying not to think too hard about the fact that it threw itself into existence blind and keeps doing it to the next batch. None of this means every single person is malicious. Malice would almost be a relief. At least you can reason about malice, you can hold it accountable. What you're dealing with instead is something far slipperier, moral incompetence flooded with sentimentality. People who really do feel love while being utterly careless about its consequences. People who cry over their children's pain and then insist they do it all again because facing the alternative would annihilate their entire identity structure. The curse of seeing this is that you can't go back. You can't unlearn that most people are not suited to the ethical weight of life. You can't unsee that many of them are justifying an ongoing slaughterhouse of suffering with hallmark language and bad metaphysics. You can't pretend that the endless cycle of birth, pain, coping, and death is obviously worth continuing just because it's familiar. You live in the same world they do, but you're not in the same story anymore. You realize the responsible thing is not to fix every broken person, not to reform an entire species that doesn't want to be reformed, but to break the chain where you can, to refuse to add more minds to the firing line, to refuse to treat reproduction as neutral, to refuse to applaud people for carrying on the legacy when that legacy is confusion, harm, and denial. The average person thinks that kind of stance is hatred. It's not. It's the first real act of compassion most of them will ever encounter, and they can't recognize it because it doesn't flatter them. Compassion that actually counts doesn't say, "Everything you've done is fine, don't feel bad." Real compassion is willing to say, "You are dangerous without meaning to be, and we need to limit the damage." If you can see this, if it all feels grimly obvious instead of shocking, then you are already living in a different mode from most of the species. You're not better as a person in some mystical sense. You're just less anesthetized, less willing to lie to yourself, less willing to confuse habit for morality and tradition for truth, that clarity hurts. It isolates you. It makes you sound cruel to people who can't tell the difference between comfort and care, but it also gives you the one thing they don't have, the ability to step back from the script and say, "No, this stops with me." That is the dividing line. The average person sees the mess, shrugs, and has a baby. You see the mess and refuse to throw anyone else into it. They call it selfish. They call it cowardly. In reality, it's the only adult decision in the entire room.